Yesterday, we talked about how the Zimbabwean government was at it again, fighting its favorite war, the war against the poor. We talked about how the government have set their sights on street vendors, declaring an all-out assault on anyone trying to eke out an honest living in a country where formal employment is as rare as a Zupco bus arriving on time. Minister Daniel Garwe, in a move that screams, I have no idea how the economy works, gave vendors, or rather he gave municipalities 48 hours to make sure that vendors pick up and disappear. Because of course nothing says economic progress like forcing thousands of struggling Zimbabweans into deeper poverty. The government, which has failed at everything except self-preservation, has now decided that the biggest enemy to the national development is not corruption, it's not looting, it's not mismanagement, but rather the hard-working men and women selling airtime, tomatoes, and second-hand clothes on the streets. Apparently, the real cause of Zimbabwe's economic collapse is not years of plundering by the elite, not the billions lost to gold smuggling, but rather the old woman selling bananas at Copacabana. But in Mtare, the vendors have responded with the kind of energy ZANU-PF itself would admire. Pure, unfiltered, riotous defiance. When municipal police showed up at Sakuvareng, expecting an easy day of harassing defenseless people, they were instead met with a storm of stones and a furious resistance that would make Liberation War heroes nod in approval. The police, in their borrowed bravery, tried to enforce the Garwe directive, but they quickly learned that when you push desperate people too far, they push back harder. The sight of municipal vehicles fleeing under a hail of rocks was a poetic reversal. Normally it's the other way, it's the vendors running from these same officers. Not today. Today it was the police scrambling, trying to escape the very people they had come to torment. The very people they assumed would simply bow down and accept their fate. But when you have nothing left to lose, fear becomes a foreign concept. These vendors, already forced to live on the edge of survival, had finally decided enough was enough. It turns out that when you rob people of their last source of income, they don't respond with thank you notes, they respond with flying projectiles. The scene in Mtare was reminiscent of the country's liberation struggle, except this time, the war was not against a colonial regime, but against a local one that behaves just like the oppressors of old. If you remember again some days ago, this is the same police that we reported that went on to slash a maize crop that was already reaching maturity. Meanwhile, in Harare, a different kind of drama is unfolding. Do you remember the vendors for ED? Yeah, those ones. Those same folks who during election season sang praises of Mnangagwa, danced in ZANU-PF regalia, and declared their undying loyalty to the new dispensation. Well, now that the honeymoon is over, reality has kicked in hard. These vendors, who were once part of the campaign machinery, are now realizing that ZANU-PF does what ZANU-PF does best. Use you, then toss you aside like expired meal. Feeling betrayed, they are now threatening to take the councils to court. Oh, the irony. One moment they were chanting ED fair, and the next they are lawyering up to fight the very system they helped sustain. If Karma was a legal entity, it would be their chief witness. The very vendors who once proudly wore ZANU-PF t-shirts, who attended rallies and ululated for their savior, are now standing in courtrooms trying to understand how their beloved party turned against them so quickly. Their love for Mnangagwa was deep, but not deep enough to shield them from reality. The government, in its usual style, made all sorts of promises to those people, convincing them that supporting the ruling party would mean protection and prosperity. But as history has shown, ZANU-PF promises are like an Econet data bundle. It gets finished before you even get a chance to enjoy them. And now, the Vendors for ED movement finds itself in the same position as every other Zimbabwean, betrayed, abandoned, and forced to fight for survival against the very government they once cheered for. But let's take a moment to appreciate the logic of this entire operation. The government, which has failed to provide jobs, failed to stabilize the economy, and failed at literally everything except oppression, is now punishing people for trying to survive. Instead of creating formal employment, they are busy destroying the only livelihoods many Zimbabweans have left. And who benefits from all this? Certainly not the struggling mother selling tomatoes to feed her children. Not the unemployed youth selling airtime just to scrape by. But of course, the well-fed ministers and their business cronies who see vendors as illegal traders rather than citizens abandoned by their own government. They sleep just fine at night. The government has no problems with real criminals. Those who steal millions from the state, those who smuggle gold and diamonds, those who loot public funds. But it is an overwhelming problem with a vendor selling second-hand clothes. To the authorities, grand corruption is acceptable, but selling vegetables without a license is a crime worthy of police brutality. The government isn't waging a war against disorder, it's waging a war against survival, waging a war against its own citizen. It doesn't want Zimbabweans to live outside the system because it knows it has failed to create a system that works for them. Instead of fixing its mess, it simply wants to criminalize those that are trying to make the best out of a bad situation. What's even more laughable is how the government is pretending that it is about restoring order. Oh, please. The same government that allows potholes to swallow entire cars overnight is suddenly concerned about urban order. The same government that can't even maintain traffic lights wants to talk about tidiness. Maybe when Zimbabweans start selling second-hand dignity, someone in power will finally buy some. The streets of Harare and other cities have been long chaotic, not because of vendors, but because of the government's failure to manage urban planning. The authorities love to act tough on the weakest members of the society, while turning a blind eye to the real problems. Ministers drive around in convoy worth millions, funded by taxpayers who can't even afford basic health care. Politicians live in mansions while the people they claim to serve struggle to put food on their table. And yet, the government's biggest priority right now is ensuring that a vendor doesn't sell bananas without permission. For now, we watch as the battle lines are drawn. Will the government win this war against its own people? Or will the vendors, the last true entrepreneurs of Zimbabwe, show that no amount of repression can silence a people determined to survive? This is a government that fears its own citizens more than it fears external enemies. They have tanks for protesters, but no ambulances for patients. They have riot police for vendors, but no jobs for graduates. And yet they expect the people to be silent. They expect Zimbabweans to just accept that their only crime is being poor. But history has a way of dealing with regimes like this. You can only push people so far before they push back. And if what happened in Mutare is anything to go by, the government might have just picked a fight it cannot win. We are back to the colonial regime. Except there is no Britain supporting Smith. Except there is no South Africa supporting Smith. Except there is no white men running the government. However, the laws of repression that are being enacted day in and day out, the Law and Order Maintenance Act, the Broadcasting Services Bill, heart tax, bicycle tax, we are back to the colonial era. We are back to Ian Smith's regime. We're suffering. And the government should just know that when people are pushed like that, whatever happened during the Smith era will happen now. There was an uprising. And people will rise up and fight. The people are watching. The vendors are resisting. And the streets are speaking. And while you are here, do the sensible thing. Subscribe to Zimwaves TV, because someone has to keep telling the truth in this country.